consider, because I'm looking at a list right now, it's considered a sign of religious ecstasy, not possession. I don't really understand what that means, but like most people that do come to be possessed by demons end up like speaking in tongues or something of the like. And then the next thing is knowing and revealing things the person has like no earthly way of knowing. A common one also is like the person being physically strong beyond natural, like their natural physical makeup, like their anatomy way beyond their capability. And then the most obvious one is a violent aversion to God, the Virgin Mary, the cross, holy water, anything like images of Catholic faith, anything surrounding that. But are there any other ones you can think of that are like signs of it?
They always show like extreme physical deterioration, like in either books, movie, any media, and then any alleged accounts of it. Either most of the time it's the person losing weight, be like having open sores, just looking really gaunt, demon-like,
Yeah.
the bloodshot eyes, pissing and shitting all over the room, and blood pouring
Isolation is one of the
orifice.
big ones
What's
that's not
that?
really talked about. The basic point of the way that a demon breaks a person down is to get them by themselves. And when the person is under any kind of influence, when they're under any kind of attack, they will withdraw away from everyone. Because either A, everybody thinks they're fucking crazy and won't listen to them, because if you say someone, like I see a demon when I sleep and he like beats the shit out of me or whatever, they're like, no, you're fucking nuts. And people stop taking you seriously, so you withdraw. Other times, what you see commonly in like movies and stuff, the person will say, the demon told me it was going to kill my family if I didn't, do a certain thing, if I didn't, avoid them for a certain amount of time, things like that. So that's really one of the telltale signs, is when you have someone that's full of life and is very vibrant and everything, and then all of a sudden, they just disappear off the face of the earth. And what's so dangerous about it is because it just sounds like half of the mental disorders that people develop. And that's part of the game. Because think about it, if you're a demon, like, you're not going to make it obvious that you're afflicting someone. You need to be able to hide behind something else. And so the vast majority of people will see this stuff happening and say, oh, the person's having an anxiety attack, the person's depressed. And that's the end of it. And they'll just leave it at that. And the demon is free to go to work and do whatever he wants.
Yeah, I totally agree with the hiding behind, like, looking like a mental disorder, but also toward Amanda's point, something that could cause you to be an easy target is already having a pre-existing mental disorder, because if you're already weak mentally, it's easy to take over your mind. So
Exactly.
maybe those things go hand in hand, and it's not just, oh, it's a mental disorder or it's possession. Sometimes they might be both together.
Exactly.
Like I know in the Exorcist movie that we were watching, they were saying, oh, like it might be Tourette's or it might be schizophrenia. They were trying to diagnose her, and then they're just like, oh, it's a neurological problem, like just being really vague about it.
Because the person with schizophrenia is already isolated because nobody believes them already. You're sitting duck, you're wide open.
Yeah, and then Amanda, did you want to talk about, because you obviously were looking at something earlier, you mentioned something to me about how when people actually do perform exorcisms and they don't do it often because of this, didn't you say that most of them don't actually survive the exorcism? Like they will die if they're actually possessed?
Well, not necessarily if they're actually possessed, but just in general, because of how catastrophic it is and how much of a toll it takes on an individual's body. Like, I mean, a good example that everybody can take advantage of, if you have Netflix, of course. I had started watching it, but I haven't finished it quite yet. It's called Belief, the Possession of Janet Moses. They performed a 4-day exorcism on this woman, and the parts that I had watched were the very beginnings of signs of her being possessed, or possessed is probably the correct way of doing it, where she, she had somewhat of an abusive boyfriend. He was kind of an alcoholic. However, they lived in a very closely knitted community. Like you would say somebody was your brother or your sister, and technically they weren't even related to you. It was a very confined community too. They didn't really involve people outside. It was almost like a religious community, or I guess it is the best way to put it. And they had their own doctors, they had their own spiritualists. Whether you want to call it a witch doctor or not is completely up to you. But essentially, there was at one, an average day where everybody was at the bar and they're all hanging out. And Janet, the unfortunate person that had this happen to them, uh, suddenly started to show signs of withdrawal. She started having weird outbreaks of aggression. And they couldn't, and then they claimed that this was extremely abnormal behavior for this individual, and that she was normally a very bubbly, talkative individual. And they went to take her somewhere, I can't remember where, and she was in a vehicle with very, very close people. And when she left the community, she all of a sudden started having a mental breakdown where she was screaming to or at someone who was really close to her, "I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you." And she's like trying to attack her, and they're holding her down as best they can. And the woman that she was saying this to was completely distraught. Like, this, you would never imagine this person doing this to you. And the part that I got to is where she started to look like she was inflicting harm on herself, or she was starving herself, which is a typical thing that they see, where you start to cut yourself off, even your body, and your body starts to then feed on itself. And they had called in their spiritual doctor, and that is when they performed a 4-day exorcism, which ultimately led to her death. And that's where I kind of wonder if essentially that is the kind of the same scenario that occurs in the true story that they based the exorcism of Emily Rose off of, which was a young woman in Germany. They performed this exorcism on her, and unfortunately she died due to being severely underweight, with pneumonia and broken knees from constant flexing, or pounding on the knees. And ultimately this family got charged with neglect, and they were sentenced to a 6-month jail term that was reduced to 3 years of probation. But the parents and the 2 priests were found guilty of this negligence. So it kind of, when it comes to performing exorcisms, and I don't think they could say it any better than the way that they, stated it in the movie The Exorcist, like, we don't do this anymore. We, exhaust all other options first before we even consider that. And that's where, psychology comes into play. And it's like, although you're kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't, because if you go through all of the prereqs in order to perform an exorcism, because obviously they need a lot of proof, because this isn't something that they do lightly. This is extreme, because obviously, I think, as we've talked about before, the Catholic Church is the only church that will do it. By the time you gather enough evidence, it's almost too late. Like, that person's so far gone. I don't even think, like, in normal circumstances, their body can come back from how heavily mutilated their bodies are.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think, I forget where I read it, when they were talking about, like, one of the reasons why they don't do it anymore, especially because I think a lot of people see everything that goes on in like the media surrounding exorcisms, and they're like, I can do that. And it's like, oh, please don't. Because this poor person is already under, like, severe stress, like beyond stress, depending on what's going on with them. And if they're malnourished, they're probably dehydrated. that's doing a million and one things to your body. And if you want to go like super stereotypical route with what you see with exorcisms, they're going to be tied to a bed and basically screamed at for the next however many days it's going to take. They're probably still not eating, still not drinking. They're either throwing up or defecating all over themselves. The only water that they may be getting is going to be holy water splashed on them. And your family's somewhere around you also under severe amount of stress. You probably have no idea what's going on. And then people are like, I can't believe they died. They had to die so that the demon could be released. And it's like, like you said, she had pneumonia. Their heart probably just gave out. Their brain was like, nope, not doing that. I'm just going to check out. We're not even going to deal with this situation. A lot of that stuff ends up being like heart failure, organ failure, dehydration, malnutrition. It just ticks all the boxes for death. And it sucks because it probably could have went the other way if it wasn't for those types of situations.
Well, like they stated in the movie The Exorcist, like she could have had Reagan admitted into a mental hospital, but her mom was like, no, 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 like you guys had your chance. And of course, you had to throw into the movie where the doctor's like, well, are you a religious woman? And she's like, oh, well, not really. But it really makes you think. And I don't even know if we have the answers because I don't know how under wraps this kind of information is. What the hell are they doing during these exorcisms that leave these people? Like, obviously, they were in bad condition before, but like, ultimately ends in their death. Like, oh my God. Now, in this case with this woman, we could easily say, which I don't know the nature of her actual death, but the fact that it was a 4-day exorcism, if she was deprived of water during that entire experience, she died of dehydration easily.
I think you guys are going to be severely disappointed when I tell you what Catholic exorcisms are actually like and what they actually entail. So when you see these movies, it's 99% just bullshit, just a pop a reaction from a crowd. Like the part where the priest is like screaming and like throwing holy water and shit at the person, like it's very heavily exaggerated. And obviously the part where like shit is flying around the room is very heavily exaggerated, depending on which accounts you read, of course. Your exorcism typically does take a long time to do. And that's something that every single movie gets wrong, just because if I have an hour and a half to tell a story, I'm not going to include a months-long process where a priest has the book. This is Dracula. This is not the Roman rite of exorcism, but he's reading from the book, and he goes through the whole book, and he's praying, and everybody in the room is responding to the prayer. He's saying God the Father, and everybody says, pray for us. He says, Mary, the Mother of God, pray for us. They go through 20-some saints' names in this litany, just reading and responding. That's not an exciting climax to a demon movie. And what's even less exciting is that it takes a very long time for anything to actually come of it. Most of the time, the person will go to the exorcist, he'll pray over them for a while, they'll leave, and come back the next day, or come back the next week. And this will go on for a very long time before they feel any sort of difference. And the part that they always conveniently forget is that a lot of times it just doesn't work. And nobody can explain why that is. That's where you get the old, it's the will of God. That's where that comes into this equation. Because that's going to come in at some point. So like when they're actually doing an exorcism, when you watch a movie, it's like a knockdown, drag out fight between a priest and a demon, where the real one is much more subdued, to say the least. You might get the person make some hissing sounds or like writhe a little bit, but they're not gonna like, if you ever watch the movie The Rite with Anthony Hopkins, I think it is, as the main priest, That's a great movie until the final scene where it just gets really ridiculous. Where like he turns into this CGI demon and like all this crazy shit's going down. The person will maybe writhe and hiss a little bit, you know, the old they hiss when you put holy water on them thing. I've witnessed that personally, and I can tell you that it's quite disturbing, to say the least. And all that other stuff you see in movies where it's heavily, heavily, heavily dramatic, it's just not realistic. It's just not what happens. And the reason that it takes so long to actually sanction an exorcism, I think you guys kind of already touched on it. Like, they can't just go to every person that claims to be possessed and give them an exorcism. Because if it turns out the person is just looking for attention and the church eats it up, then the church looks really bad. And I don't think it's a secret to any of you that the church is having a very hard time with its public image as is. It doesn't need any help by sanctioning exorcisms in the 21st century. But, and it's a very important but here, in 2008, the Vatican actually released an official proclamation that every diocese around the world needs to have an appointed exorcist. They need to have somebody on hand who is trained to do this, if it should come up. And the actual numbers of exorcism have increased pretty considerably. Not surprisingly, starting in 1973 when the movie comes out, all of a sudden everybody's claiming to be possessed, and the case numbers are spiking. It's the same thing as when the movie Sybil came out, and now every psychologist wanted to be the one to solve multiple personality disorder, now dissociative identity disorder. It creates a boom where it becomes super popular to say you're possessed. As fucked up as that sounds, it's basically what happens. And the church realizes they have to be really selective. They have to be really careful with this. So they will go through the long discernment process that you guys were talking about earlier. So you run through the basic things. You know, you do a background check on the person. You do a background check on their family and everybody around them. You bring in just a normal doctor. You bring in the psychologist, the psychiatrist. You bring in all these people. And 99% of the time, they'll be able to figure out what's wrong with the person. The person has some other disorder most of the time. But then you get that very, very, very small percentage where you can't explain what's going on with just another disorder of some kind. And that's where you get into like the marks of possession that Amanda was talking about kind of off the top of this. All of those are given by Father Gabriel Amorth in his book, An Exorcist Tells His Story. And this guy was the official Vatican exorcist for many years. And he just died recently. I want to say he died in 2018 or 2019. And he claimed to have done tens of thousands of exorcisms, which is obviously an exaggeration. But he was the official church authority on this, and he wrote 2 books about it. There was The Exorcist Tells His Story, which I loaned to one of my friends in high school and never saw again. And then there was An Exorcist More Stories, which I'll read at some point in my life. I haven't gotten there yet. And he talks about those 4 things. So the speaking in tongues thing, you know, glossolalia, as it's called sometimes, glossolalia, however you want to pronounce it, is where somebody speaks a language that they didn't know. So when you watch those movies, you see a 13-year-old and she's speaking in Babylonian. To people that don't know ancient language, it just sounds like she's saying gibberish. It's almost like if I sent you guys a clip of like people speaking Hindi now, like I would kind of have an idea what's going on because I study it, I'm trying to learn it. But to you guys, it just sounds like random sounds. That's how it is when I hear a lot of languages. You know, I have no idea what's being said. It just sounds like garbled nonsense. But when you bring somebody in that actually knows the language being spoken, and this was actually the scary part of the movie, The Fourth Kind, you know, the alien abduction movie, if you ever watched that one. the aliens are speaking in Sumerian. And when I think it was Mila Kunis was the main character. Mila someone. I don't know.
Jovovich.
Okay, I don't know my actors and actresses at all. When she brings in her buddy, he's like a professor of ancient Near Eastern studies or whatever. And when he hears the recording of the aliens like talking to her in her house, he's like, they're speaking Sumerian and this is what they're saying. And he's like freaked the fuck out. He's like, nobody's spoken this language in 4,000 years. Where did you get this tape? And she says, it was in my bedroom the other night. And then that's like when that movie escalates a lot. That was when it got scary. Anyway, you get a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old speaking like Latin to you. You're like, okay, this is weird. But maybe they picked it up on TV. You can always find your way out of it. You know, like if I started speaking a strange language right now, you would all think, oh, you know, he read this from a script. He memorized it. You know, it's an act. All right, it's an act. So the next one on the list you have is aversion to the sacred. This one is the easiest one to fake. This one is a classic. You know, even in Dracula, when Dr. Van Helsing takes out a crucifix, the vampire recoils. It's one of the classic scenes of that old movie with Bela Lugosi, the 1931 movie. Any kind of evil entity is supposed to be afraid of Christian symbolism. It's just kind of part of the story. And the one that Father Amorth talks about in the book is this. He says, many times people will tell me they're possessed, but I will know that they're faking. I'll know that they have some reason to be faking this. You know, somebody who is desperate for attention from their family, somebody who thinks they can get publicity from it. Whatever reason someone has for faking a possession. He says, when I go to their home to evaluate their case, I will be praying and stuff. And in my vial, you know, the glass vial where holy water would be, he just takes water from the sink. He just takes tap water. And he splashes it on the person. And when they writhe in pain, he knows that they're faking. And that's how he shuts down a lot of people who are just putting on a show, as it were. It's easy to fake aversion to the sacred. You know, most people have an aversion to the sacred normally. They don't need to be possessed. Okay, I've heard many of students say to me, if I set foot in a church, I'd get set on fire. I'd get struck by lightning. All right, you know, that's an easy one. You have knowledge of the unknowable. Here you go. In the movie The Rite, one of the earlier exorcism scenes, basic premise of this movie is that there's a young priest who is very jaded, who doesn't really want to be a priest. And the opening scene of the movie is him at the end of seminary. Like, he's getting his degree, he's done with his schooling, whatever. And he goes to the priest who runs the seminary and he says, you know, Father, I'm really having doubts. I don't think I want to do this. And the guy sees right through him and he says, well, you know, if you don't want to be a priest, then you're just going to have to pay us for the 4 years of college that we just gave you. And then, you know, you can go about and do whatever. Because presumably lots of people had done that before. So he ends up having to stick out being a priest. And the movie is him trying to discern if he actually wants to. And when he sees this Vatican decree about having an exorcist in every diocese, he decides he's going to go to Rome. He's going to go to one of these exorcism classes. And this was the scene that was in every trailer of this movie. It's like a bunch of nuns and shit sitting in a big room, and they're watching on a projector, and you like hear disembodied voices, and there's like people all contorted around and stuff. And it's like a bunch of nails on like a board, and the narrator's like, these nails came out of this person's mouth during the exorcism and all this stuff, you know. It was in every trailer of that movie because it was one of the cooler scenes. Anyhow, the young priest, I don't remember his name. You know, he kind of looked like Matt Damon, so like you could call him Father Matt Damon if you want. Goes with Anthony Hopkins to investigate this possession case of this young woman. And Anthony Hopkins says to him, he takes a dollar bill out of his pocket and he says, put this in your pocket, just look at the date. Or better yet, I think he actually tells him, take this dollar bill and don't look at the date, just put it in your pocket. So he does. And they go to this girl who's possessed. And Anthony Hopkins says to the younger priest, ask her what you have in your pocket. And she says, you have a dollar bill from 1945 in your pocket right now. She like snarls at him and shit because she's possessed. But the guy doesn't believe it. And when he leaves, he doesn't look in his pocket. He doesn't until he gets in his room later that night. And there it is. It's 1945. How the hell did she know? Well, because something told her, basically. And the one that I experienced personally of this was when someone who had never met my grandmother described her to me in very vivid detail. Her nickname, all of her hobbies, all the things she liked to do, her favorite color, all this kind of stuff. How did they know that? That one's a little tougher to explain. And then lastly, you have superhuman abilities, which is where you see something like the person is sitting in a chair, and it's like a young kid or an old person in a chair, and they snap the legs off the chair during the exorcism. That's heavily exaggerated for movies, but other accounts of this have been recorded, where somebody will suddenly become very heavy, and you're not able to move them. And you'll read accounts of people where someone will be possessed. They're very small, they weigh 100, 120 pounds, and they fall on the ground and their arms are like outstretched on the floor. Picture someone's hand is on the floor, and the person who's with them goes to move their hand and they can't move their hand. It's held down as if it is rooted in place. That kind of thing is very difficult to explain. Okay. And I can tell you all, when you see those kind of things, it completely changes your outlook on everything. Because until I saw all of that shit for myself, I was very much one of those people that thought, okay, it makes a scary movie. The church is a nice place for little kids and old ladies. But as I started to see this shit personally firsthand, and as I started to hear other people talk about it, I would just meet people when I was in school, and we'd talk and we'd become friends, and it would always somehow come up in one way or another. I do make it a point not to bring this up like on my own. If I'm trying to get somebody's story, I want them to come to me. I'm not comfortable being like, hey, tell me about that time you were possessed. Like, I can't do that. Maybe I should. Maybe I'd be a better investigator or whatever, but I don't think so. I don't like to plant ideas in people's head. I like to let them talk to me first. Like, one of the classics is when people ask me about what I've seen at Keystone, I'll always tell them like, oh, well, tell me what you've seen first. Because I know if I describe my stories, theirs will be eerily similar, except they'll one-up mine just a little bit. Like, I saw a 7-foot tall shadow figure. They saw a 9-foot shadow figure. And that's just human nature. You just have to be aware of it. So, when you talk about, we're going to keep going with it, talk about the stages of possession, the way that it progresses, follows a pretty observable pattern every time, according to, the experts, if you will. And I don't have a very large data set myself, but I can tell you that I did see the pattern happen. You have a period of infestation is often seen as the first one, where this person comes into contact with this demonic force in some way or another, whether it is through a Ouija board or something else. It's not always the old like, oh, I conjured Satan on my Ouija board. Like, that's not always the thing, but it does make for a good opening scene in a movie. The one I saw recently was Ouija, Origin of Evil. I thought it was chilling enough. I'd watch it again. But you get that first contact stage. And the reason that the Ouija board is so dangerous is because you don't actually know what you're communicating with. And it'll tell you some shit like, who are you? Oh, I'm Timmy. Oh, what happened to you? I was 7 years old and I lost my mom and I'm really scared and I just need someone to talk to. Will you talk to me? And once you give it assent, once you give it entrance into your life, then the whole process can begin. Because with any kind of evil, at least within Christianity, it doesn't have power on its own. It has the power that you give to it, which is why, for example, a vampire needs to be invited to enter your home. He can't come in. He only comes in when you let him. And to be let in, they will find any kind of way to try to lure you, to make you think it's a good thing. And when you watch the Exorcist movie, at least in the book, when Reagan plays with the Ouija board, it's a friendly person. And, he wants to be friends with her and all this stuff. And she just has to, keep talking to him, keep giving him more access. When you watch Annabelle Creation, because I've seen that one. I don't think I saw the original Annabelle, actually. But the family, it's like Kate Winslet, I think, and then like some random guy, I don't know who he was. The story was that their daughter died. She got hit by a car, and the husband made fucking dolls for a living for whatever reason. So he makes this doll, and it's in the house, and the daughter has been dead, but they miss her so much because they live out in the desert. And they pray one night to anybody who is listening to send their daughter back to them. And then they start hearing footsteps and hearing her laughter. They can smell her when they go in her room. It's just like she's there. And they communicate with her spirit. And she just asks them, can you let me go into that doll? And when they say yes, it turns out it was never their daughter. It was always this demon. And then that's the whole like premise of the movie, is that the fucking doll is possessed. Okay. So you don't just like talk to a demon one day and you're possessed the next day. It's also a drawn out process, because just as the exorcism is a drawn out process, it's a long ongoing thing. And you go through a couple stages. And the first is the so-called obsession stage, where it's what it sounds like. It's always on your mind. You're losing sleep over it. You keep seeing it in your nightmares. You keep seeing it in your dreams. You keep feeling dread when you're by yourself that you didn't feel before. You sense that something is wrong. Okay, and it kind of consumes you. It starts off small. It starts as minor inconveniences, but it slowly ratchets up the pressure. And the point of this attack is to make you weak, is to make you doubt your sanity. And a lot of movies do a very good job with this part. And there's a couple where like the wise old guy explains it in very good detail. That's very true to life. Where he says, it starts with like a knock on the wall in the middle of the night and a strange odor in a part of the home. And then it gradually just escalates. It gets more and more intense. And that distant knocking, those scratches on the door, pretty soon become knocking right next to you and scratches on your body. And this is where you enter into the oppression stage, where the person is physically under assault by this being, by this entity, where they are just being hammered down, where they are at a loss, They don't really know what to do about it. They don't know where to turn. They've kind of been cut off from everybody. They're physically being attacked. And I joked about this a couple weeks ago, but I was scrolling through, like I've added a shitload of paranormal groups on Instagram to try to get them to follow back and generate followers for this page. And the one weekend, like everyone had pictures of like a mundane scratch on the person's arm. They were like, we were attacked during this investigation. And I was sitting there like, if we're going to get followers, that's something that we got to do, I guess. Either that or sex appeal, one or the other, which we can either have sex appeal or fake demon attacks to get followers, is what I've gathered. And we don't have either of those at the moment. So anyway, as the person finally becomes broken down, they become less and less able to resist the advances and the power of this entity. And that's when the possession happens, where the person's will is weakened to the point that they can't fight off the entity taking over their body and, you know, controlling them. And even this progresses in stages, where when you watch a lot of those movies, you can kind of see where it's going, where sometimes it's the actual person and sometimes it's the demon. That's like, the way they do it in movies is like, you have the demon's eyes and then you have the normal person's eyes, and that's how you know the difference. And then like they have different voices or whatever. The person's will is not yet completely gone. I don't think it often gets to the point that the person's will is gone so that the demon is completely in control, because usually the person will kill themselves before they get to that point. And the whole purpose of this, at least according to Christianity, is that demons are trying to take souls away from God and cast souls into hell. And suicide has long been the unforgivable sin. You know, when you kill yourself, the sin isn't that you killed yourself. The sin is that you despaired. The sin is that you said to yourself, I am in such a bad state right now that not even God himself can help me, and I'm going to take myself out of this. That's what the sin is in a suicide. You know, we think it's the person killing themselves, it's the despair that leads to it. And obviously, you know, that's been factored in recent years as we kind of understand how the mind works now, where we didn't previously. But when you see all these stories of like possessions being deadly and exorcisms being deadly, the exorcisms usually are not. They're usually pretty mundane and not very eventful. But when it just kind of progresses, when it keeps going on and on and on, then very often the goal of the demon is to drive the person to insanity or to suicide. That's kind of the end goal, to completely and utterly just crush them from the inside out. So that's what I have to say about that.
So did I miss you explaining how you had firsthand experience of any of this? Or did you say you didn't want to talk about it and I missed it?
I don't want to talk about it, but I will give you the general version. Someone I was very close to displayed all of the things that I talked about. And then I've spoken to multiple others who have experienced similar things. So that's as detailed as I really want to go with it.
Oh, sure. I didn't mean to pry. I just thought
you're good.
I missed it.
Oh, no. No, that's not a YouTube friendly conversation. That's a when we're sitting in person conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing that. So this is where I get confused with the Catholic concept of this. So if someone's possessed, it is against their will. So how, if you're looking at the Catholic theology or dogma, whatever, however you want to look at it, of the idea of Satan taking a soul, how in the world could that happen against someone's will? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, if they haven't done anything to deserve it, if they haven't sinned, right? How would then from the Catholic perspective, Satan be able to take someone else's soul through a possession? Because that's like stealing one. And I would think that that would be way against old rules. Right?
Well, there's a couple different ideas on this one. A lot of time, the person just gets so broken down to the point that they just don't resist anymore. And something that I should have said, a significant reason that a demon wants a body is that a demon is not a corporeal entity, corporeal, if you will. You know, it doesn't have a shape. It doesn't have a body. It can't do anything. It can make you do things for it, but it itself is powerless. It can't do shit. Okay, but it can convince us that it can do all these things. It's when you do the baptismal promises thing, you know, where you reject Satan and all his works and his empty promises and all that shit. The demon's trying to get a physical body because then it can do stuff. You know, kind of, can you fit two souls in one body? Well, the answer is yes, because the soul doesn't take up space. And what'll happen to the person is that their will either be kind of just crushed to the point that there isn't shit they can do, or what's even worse and what's even more frightening is when people will willingly seek out possession. Like if you ever saw the movie The Possession of Michael King, it's based on this idea where this dude is a hardcore atheist and he wants to prove that religion is bullshit. So he goes from place to place and finds like all these people that claim to be into this stuff. And he says, summon a demon, make me get possessed. So they do. And the guy gets possessed and he basically is like, he regrets it throughout the whole movie and then he kills himself and that's the end of the movie. Because what ultimately happens is one of the key like things in it is that he always hears a buzzing in his ears and it's driving him nuts throughout this whole movie. And he doesn't know what it is. But then finally at the very end, the buzzing stops. And now he hears the voice of the demon. And that breaks him to the point that he just wants it to stop. And he realizes that the buzzing was his wife. Like she died in a tragic accident. And that's why he was so like hardened against God and all that stuff. She was taken very young from him. He realized that the buzzing in his ears was her protecting him so that he didn't have to hear the demon. And he hears her voice one last time and he jumps out the window at the end because he doesn't want the demon to have his body. And that one was pretty decent. I thought that was a pretty good movie.
Mm.
But as far as like taking souls and all this stuff, when you talk about possession, one thing that's really important to note is that the soul is never what's possessed. It's just the body. The person is still there. They're just kind of being held hostage is one way of describing it. And, you know, you'll see that sometimes where in the midst of some of those exorcism movies like Emily Rose, as the demon is like in the midst of whatever, all of a sudden it'll stop being the demon's face and it'll be the little girl's face. And she's like terrified and doesn't know where she is and everything. And the demon will use that to get the priest to stop doing the exorcism, basically. That's heavily exaggerated. That's movie stuff. But
You know what movie series would actually play in? And I think it's kind of a little bit more of a realistic representation of it, other than like the CGI bodies flying everywhere, are the Paranormal Activity movies. I don't know why I randomly just thought about that. I think it was more of like the marked ones, the very last one, which I actually think was pretty darn good. But that essentially was all demon possessions. And I mean, what kind of ending would we have gotten if there was an actual exorcism that occurred with the main character? Because hell, she went through a lot. It started from when she was a kid and worked its way all the way up until she was an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that the possession that she encountered is a little bit more what I would expect from possession of like You literally just start walking around. It's almost like sleepwalking. Because in that, I would feel like that would be a good time for it to take over is during your sleep, because the fact that your consciousness is put down, and that's when
Your
anything can take over.
your body is hanging out, it's free to anything that enters, which I had a friend a couple years ago who he claimed he was astral projecting. And that's not something I've done too much looking into. That's something I would just shun like the plague if it were up to me. And he basically says, like, I astral project at night and like I see my body there, and there's all these other things like around me trying to get into my body when I leave, because it's kind of like an open vessel that's waiting for something to enter into it. That's a very dangerous kind of thing.
Is that basically what happened to in the movie Insidious?
Yes.
Is it Insidious?
Mhm.
Yeah, with the little boy, because he left his body. So that's basically astro projecting or whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.